Good morning, everybody. I'm going to officially kick this off. Welcome, everyone, to OP Radio. We have another great episode lined up for you today about something very near and dear to our hearts at Optimism, retroactive public goods funding. Before we get into the meat of the matter, the heart of the conversation, I'd actually just like to go around and allow everyone to just introduce themselves. So why don't we let Ben start and we can just go from there.
Hey, what's going on, y'all? My name is Ben. I'm one of the founders of the Optimism Collective. We're really excited to be here making strides, funding public goods. And I make shitpost musical song parodies on my Twitter in my spare time. Thanks for joining me, y'all.
Bobby, do you want to go next?
Greetings, people. My name is Bobby. I work at the foundation. I, along with Jonas, have put a lot of effort into making RetroPGF 2 happen from start to finish. And so we're really stoked to announce all of the results of voting and funding today, and just generally really excited to see where this whole project goes.
Speaking of Jonas, want to say hello to the folks on OP Radio?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Jonas. I work at the Optimism Foundation on retroactive public goods funding. So as Bobby said, a lot of work went into this, and this day is like super rewarding, finally putting it out there and seeing the Twitter timeline full of excitement. So happy to chat more about this.
Thank you so much. And as for the rest of our guests, I don't want to butcher any names. So maybe if people could just jump in and say hello and say who you are and what you do real quickly, that'd be awesome.
Okay, maybe I'll go. I'm Alicia.8 from ENS, and I'm excited that I was a first-time badge holder for the RetroPGF round 2.
Hey, I'm Chris from L2Beat, and I had the pleasure to be both a badge holder and working on actually 2 projects that were nominated to RPGF.
Hey, my name is Charlie from the Agora team here. We build kind of governance software, and super excited to get the pleasure of being nominated this last round's RetroPGF. So excited to be here.
And I'll wrap it up then. My name is Ludens. I help run this organization called Lattice. We're the core dev of this framework called Mud. It's a piece of software that allows for large Ethereum applications and stuff like virtual worlds. We made OPCraft, which I think was like the first app running on a OP chain. And yeah, both like the other folks here on both sides, both a badge holder and someone who worked on some projects that got nominated. So that was an interesting experience on both sides.
Okay, awesome. And my name is Mac, by the way. I'm going to be guiding this conversation along with my colleagues, Ben and Bobby and Jonas. So thanks for that, guys. Thanks, everybody, for introducing yourselves. To kick this off, I want to just sort of set the stage and start sort of broad, big picture, and then we can narrow down. So this first question is going to be posed to Ben. Ben, we talk about RetroPGF a lot. I think we have some sense for what it is, but for the listeners who may not, what is this? What is retroactive public goods funding, and why do we do it?
Oh, yeah, baby. It's only at the heart and the soul of the entire crypto economy and its creation. Come on now. Yeah, okay, so no, but it's a fair question. We're going to do a Twitter space on what is RetroPGF. We should explain what that is. Okay, I think there's 2 pieces to any answer there, right? One of the pieces is the PGF, the public goods funding, and the other is the retro. And so I'll actually start with the public goods funding piece, and I think in particular, we hear the term public goods a lot in crypto. It's a very exciting, active field. I think it's important to view public goods through the lens of optimism in this conversation, which is very much to view the critical public goods as a market failure of the platform and of the scaling ecosystem that we're creating here. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that ultimately, a public good has this abstract academic definition, right? That basically says anything that people produce that they, basically can't charge for and they can't prevent people from accessing it is a public good, right? Like for, as a prime example, a piece of open source code. So what we observe many, time and again within crypto is that those public goods go underfunded in relation to the rest of what happens in the ecosystem, right? The simple example here is if you look at the amount of money that Ethereum, or the amount of ETH that Ethereum has spent on its research and development versus the amount that is spent on its own network security, right? The numbers are hugely skewed towards network security, right? When at the end of the day, we wouldn't have a network to secure without the public good of the source code that powers everything. So it's important to understand that at the end of the day, these public goods are a market failure, right? It's not just that we want to feel good and be funding the people that are creating the software. That is the most important thing to do if we want to have the best software. So public goods funding is the goal of solving those market failures where people are creating something that they can't really charge for and funding it as a public good. How am I doing so far? Tracking? Making sense?
Absolutely. No, great description. Yeah, I just look at it as a way of effectively allocating resources retroactively.
Yeah, so that's sort of the next part, right? I think it's important to distinguish between public goods funding as just a concept of, funding a certain class of goods. And then it's important to talk about the retroactive piece, right? So where does the retro in RetroPGF fit in? Well, the idea is that these funding choices are a lot harder when you have to guess what is going to be the outcome of the funding that you're funding in the future, right? So for example, let's say that, there's an important piece of client software that you want to exist. One option is to, and that's going to be a public good, that software. One option is to try to guess who's going to create the best software and go and fund it. That is a lot harder of a problem than once the client software exists, looking back on it and saying, hey, this was a super important and valuable thing. So the idea of retroactive public goods funding is ultimately to do that public goods funding thing, but do it after the fact. Set the expectation up front, but do the funding after the fact. And the idea is that allows you to be much more effective in terms of how you allocate your capital. And it, creates a flywheel of people searching to get funded retroactively, and off to the races we go. So 2 parts. Fund the public goods. That's the code that doesn't get rewarded. We got to reward it. Do it retroactively. Much easier to figure out what the deserving reward is. Much easier to allocate effectively.
Awesome. Yeah, which brings us to today's big news, right? Which is we just announced that 10 million OP were distributed to the people in the projects that have helped develop the OP stack and grow the Optimism ecosystem. So to talk more about that, I want to address this next question to Bobby. Bobby, we, in this round of retroactive public goods funding, which is the second round, we divided the recipients into 3 different categories, right? Infrastructure, tooling, and education. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the methodology or the thinking behind these 3 different categories.
Yeah, for sure. So if I zoom way, way, way out and get ambitious as possible, RetroPGF is this experiment that we hope can snowball into an improvement on our modern economy. And so Ben talked a lot about funding public goods and a bit about how a lot of modern markets fail to fund public goods adequately. And so if we run this thing in enough rounds with enough iteration, if Optimism and its collective grows big enough to include the entire world, then maybe RetroPGF is basically just this better version of how economies should think about funding and supporting public goods. And so that's like the maximum extreme. But obviously we have a lot of rounds of this type of funding to do to get there. And one of the main variables in each round is the scope of what can be funded. And so like you just mentioned, Mac, the scope of this round, the scope of RetroPGF round 2 is public goods that support the development and usage of the OP stack. And so the OP stack is this basically the core protocol that runs Optimism. And so right now that includes, you can look at the basic monorepo that Optimism runs off of, but it really expands to include the protocol everywhere from governance to the social layer of things that people are building on top of it. And in setting the scope for this round, supports development and usage of the OP stack, we also included these 3 categories because we wanted to help people apply that overarching scope to a couple of slightly more specific examples. And so we have a category around infrastructure and dependencies, which is, as we described it, software that's used to build or deploy the OP stack, and contributions to the many, many protocols and standards that OP stack runs on, and some experiments like Ludens might talk about in a little bit that support future development of the protocol. So we also had a second category around tooling and utilities. And so there's tons of developer tooling that we rely on to actually build this thing. And some of those things are crypto specific. And a lot of those pieces of tooling are open source dependencies that have nothing to do with crypto. Those things were in scope as well. And then there's also a lot of tooling that folks have started to build or develop that helps collective members interact with governance. And so we wanted to include that as an example as well. And then the last category is education, which is, I think, super important because it's how the collective makes itself legible and beginner friendly to this whole universe of people who might align with its values, but might have a harder time just like wrapping their head around how the thing works or what it's doing. So basically, these categories weren't prescriptive. We didn't say at all like, it has to be this much OP allocated in this category and this much OP in that category. They were really just there to help people kind of understand the breadth of this funding round and to give folks a few specific things to kind of glom onto to say, oh, I built something that sounds like it applies in that category. Maybe I should nominate myself.
Yeah, I think in a way, and future rounds, by the way, aren't necessarily going to have categories. They may not. Right? We're iterating on this process, but sometimes too many options can be a bit debilitating, right? Like I'd rather be presented with 3 good options than 30 mediocre ones, right? So maybe this helped badge holders, which played an integral part in this process, and we'll get into in a bit. But maybe this helped badge holders better make a decision.
We'll have to ask them later in the space. I think that's a really important call out. And that's kind of similar to what I was going to riff on, Mac, which is to say that ultimately another reason to have categorization within public goods funding, right, is to keep in mind that ultimately the voters here are one person, one vote, quote, badge holders and, sort of citizens of the collective eventually. And when you're in that world, where there are real humans making real decisions, one of the things that you have to do is accept that there's going to be different areas of expertise, different domain expertise, and just different places where people are going to know what had what impact better than in other fields, right? This is like specialization is very natural, especially in a complex field like crypto. So even something as basic as breaking it down to where badge holders can see that they are an expert and spend more time there, I think is a really useful part of categorization.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, I want to transition here. I'd actually love for Ben and Bobby to pose some questions to our guests here, some of the badge holders and the projects. Before we do, though, I just want to highlight, we made this announcement this morning of the recipients of RetroPGF Round 2, and there's some really cool tweets coming out about it. So I'm just going to quickly read through a few of these because I think, they kind of have been giving us all the feel-good, warm and fuzzies. So one tweet says, "This is life-changing for me. Absolutely incredible, and I'm so grateful. As I get back to work, I'm doubling down on my efforts." So another tweet said, "Oh my God, I'm literally crying. Thank you for your support, badge holders. Optimism, thank you for your support for public goods. Mil gracias a todos los que apoyan la educación abierta y gratuita." This person obviously is involved in education in the Spanish-speaking community. Another tweet, "I got a retroactive grant from Optimism FND for my roll-up economics research. I genuinely feel overwhelmed. I've been releasing free crypto data analysis and educational content for years. This is the first time I've received a grant. Practically, this is really impactful in supporting me so I can produce more public good research. Emotionally, I'm intensely grateful for the appreciation. Thank you, Optimism Foundation." So yeah, Bobby, I don't know if you have anything you want to add here, but just a lot of good feelings all around, I'd say.
Yeah, I got a lot of goosebumps reading through some of those tweets. Yeah, it's just really cool to see the human impact of this sort of stuff and see folks who put in a lot of work, often without compensation or without promise of some future reward, just get rewarded by this mechanism that we're designing. And then I also want to clarify, they're tagging the Optimism FND Twitter handle, but really they are thanking the collective and the Citizens House because this is a process that exists outside of the Optimism Foundation. And I think that's a nice little segue to hear from some of the folks who actually have been voting on these projects and helping allocate this funding on behalf of the collective.
Absolutely. So, Bobby, do you want to kick it off?
Oh, for sure. Was that a segue to myself? It's like when you throw the ball up in the air and then also you try to hit it with that. Okay, cool.
That was a self-assist. You gave yourself a layup.
Yeah. Okay. So as a reminder, we have Alicia.eth here and we have Chris from L2Beat, 2 of the 71 folks who were part of this initial cohort of badge holders. And there's some information in our documentation or in the original announcement post about how badge holders were selected. It's a combination of elections from the Optimism Token House, which is the token-weighted portion of Optimism governance, portion of nominations from Optimism Core Team, selection of badge holders from the first round of retroactive public goods funding way back in 2021. And then from that set I just described, everyone got to nominate another person. So we've got this kind of transitive web of trust thing going on. So enough about that. Basically, first, just want to say thanks, y'all, for your participation. I know it's a ton of work to review projects and make selections and allocate votes and all that good stuff. Would love to just hear from each of you a little bit on how you made your selections for voting. There are 195 projects that were nominated across these three categories. How did you go about learning about these projects, making choices about who to fund what, how to allocate your votes across them? What sort of algorithm or heuristics or decision-making processes did you use? And I guess I'll kick it over to Alicia to start if you're ready.
Hey, Bobby, thanks. Yeah, so this is really exciting for me. I remember watching the results come out of the 2021 RetroPGF round, and something that stuck in my mind about seeing the results from that first round was, I think there were comments around how the distribution kind of between the projects that were allocated the most funding and the least funding wasn't that great. And so it seemed like a lot of voters voted for everyone quite equally. I thought that was quite interesting. And so when I was thinking about the distribution of my votes, I basically took, I'm looking at my Excel sheet now, but I essentially took about 35% of my voting power and I wanted to allocate it in kind of decent chunks, because thinking about projects, there are just some projects, I would say, related to the OP stack that have such an outsized impact on the ecosystem. And it was really interesting seeing those projects that kind of got those big buckets for me, then looking at the results, especially in tooling and infrastructure, and feeling maybe everyone felt like that about these couple of projects. And I think it's really just interesting looking at the top, I would say 5 to 10 recipients in each category. And I don't know, I think it's really positive that those few projects that I think have been doing this a really long time have contributed a lot to, everyone else in the space through what they do. I think they were recognized through this process, so that was really great. But then that still leaves a huge chunk of my voting allocation that was able to be distributed to a really long tail of projects. And for me, those projects were more aligned with infrastructure and then probably education towards the end. And yeah, that was also interesting because in one way I compared it to Gitcoin grants and thinking about how sometimes in Gitcoin grants rounds, the long tail doesn't actually see any kind of upside from participating because it is potentially with quadratic voting captured all at the top end of the funnel, say, with all the voting. And so I thought that was also really great about this round where it was kind of like a win-win on both ends of the spectrum for me. And I feel quite positive about the whole experience.
Amazing. I love that. There's this combo of expertise and knowledge and then this combo of learning and evaluating the rest of the ecosystem. And I think that's a really interesting balance to strike. And we've heard from a lot of other badge holders about how different parts of that were challenging or straightforward. So thank you again. Love to hear it. Chris, what about you? How did you go through this voting process?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there was almost 200 projects nominated. So I think it would be extremely hard to deeply research every single one of them. But that being said, I tried to, research every single one of them, maybe not that deeply, but at least in some way. And there were things like obviously the impact that I was mostly looking at, but also there were minus points for being VC founder having a token, because I believe such projects have usually a better ways of funding themselves. And also another important thing that I was looking at is this a project single one-man army, or is there a couple of people involved behind this project? Or maybe it's actually a collective of projects, like Protocol Guild is one of these projects, right? Or there was a very nice project, just like an umbrella for all monorepo, Optimism monorepo dependencies, from Web 2 world. And I think that's amazing that we can support folks working on boring, not Web3 stuff as well. And these were the main points that I tried to look at. And in my case, I'm a developer. I'm a technical guy, and I try to follow my heart and just vote on projects that I either knew, or I could or I just learned about, and I could quantify the impact quite easy. So that's why I also think that it's extremely important to have like a diversified set of badge holders, because I believe it's more impactful for me to just, vote on things that I understand rather than, try to build these ad hoc expertise in some, topic that, I don't know that much about, right? Yeah, that's mostly me.
That makes tons of sense. Yeah, I think that'll be one of the really interesting experimentation areas for next round, is helping people kind of lean into their local expertise and make voting allocations within the domains that they feel really, really strongly about. And then exploring some of these mechanisms to delegate voting power to others or across other categories, maybe where you feel like education is important, but you don't feel as well equipped to evaluate individual projects, and trying to figure out the right level of granularity so that folks can, be confident in their decisions, lean into their expertise, and then also, not have to write a research paper on 600 different public goods in the crypto or non-crypto ecosystems. But even like in this round, 200 projects nominated. Did you learn about any specific projects that you hadn't come across before that you were particularly impressed by or particularly kind of inspired by? And I guess we'll start with Chris, just since you're last on the mic.
Yeah, so actually I learned about few people making like extremely high quality educational materials. So, it's funny because L2P is also like space of education, and we're like researching to related risks, but still there were some people that I was totally unaware of, and it was great experience just to learn about the materials that these people created and have a chance to vote for them. And also one particular project that I wasn't aware of before was Protocol Guild. Like I didn't know that there's actually like this umbrella organization just like funding all of the different teams working on like very core of Ethereum. So that was something new.
Amazing. I love that. Yeah, those are like, there's a lot of incredible educational content out there, and sometimes it doesn't always reach all the different corners. So I'm glad that some of it's getting more visibility. What about you, Alicia? Anything that you found this round that was particularly inspiring or new to you?
It's kind of interesting just hearing Chris talk about going through the process and discovering education projects. It's interesting to think that when you're coming in cold, it's really, I would say, like a lot more, it's easier to assess the impact of an education project, because essentially, you're just trying to understand, say, like written or visual information, and you just get to consume it basically and be impacted straight away. So it's not like, say, infrastructure or tooling, where you have to like go away and potentially, commit some serious time to using it. And then it might be over a period of time that it proves to be valuable to you and things like that. So I wonder like how many education projects did pick up votes as a result of just kind of like that discoverability aspect of going through the website, which, by the way, I feel like we should just talk for a second about the execution of this entire round from the website and how easy and discoverable the projects were, how they were presented, to this mirror post, which is truly mind-blowing. I think, honestly, this mirror post is potentially like one of the greatest public goods to emerge from this entire round, in the sense that discoverability, I think, is such an issue for public goods projects. And to see, our entire, the entire OP stack represented in these three visuals is really valuable, I think, not only for future rounds of RetroPGF, but, with, say, the NS DAO, we try to do public goods funding for Gitcoin. There are so many communities and DAOs that are, trying to do what they can with public goods. And this is such a resource in itself. Okay, sorry, that got sidetracked, but I just wanted to give a shout out because it's so beautiful and amazing. And I think that goes a long way to also building the credibility of why it's important to fund public goods. So yeah, shout out to the OP team. Okay, what else? Actually, do you know what? I kind of I stayed in my lane a bit, because I just trusted that there would be other people, other badge holders that would have kind of the expertise to fill those gaps. And I kind of felt in a way like I might be doing a disservice to the projects that I really kind of was able to establish, the value and impact that they created by just almost like YOLOing into voting for, say, other projects. And so to the extent that, there are, was it 71 badge holders?
Yes.
I just kind of, I trusted the process and hoped that there would be like someone on the other side of me picking up the projects that I wasn't getting across.
Interesting. Like trust in the other badge holders and like trust in this whole set of the group to have enough expertise to evaluate the whole thing. That's a really powerful concept, and I'm interested to see how that plays out. I'm going to pass the mic to Ben. Ben, do you want to take these next two questions and keep it going?
Just to jump in here for a second. I think one thing that was super impressive to like trusting the other badge holders is the variance that we saw in how many projects badge holders voted on. So it was like 40 projects on average, which I think is like a whole lot. Like think about reviewing 40 projects. That's some good chunk of work. But then there were like individual ones going like all the way to over 100 projects. So I thought how this played out in trusting others to cover certain fields, and then other ones also taking like the broad approach of trying to review everything was really impressive. And then speaker we haven't asked yet is Ludens, who's not only behind OPCraft and Mud, but he also was a badge holder. So maybe Ludens, you want to jump in and quickly talk about how you chose projects and which ones you learned about.
Yeah, so one of the things that myself and Goop Sheep, with whom we voted together, and Goop Sheep was also a badge holder, one of the things we kind of like decided on as a voting philosophy is this idea of localized impact. I think that one of the things we saw happen like quite significantly and there's that kind of program, hey, we're giving some form of like financial incentives back to folks for having done something good, is that some of the most funded projects usually have broad impact across many different ecosystems. And it's almost kind of like a form of hedging. I mean, not necessarily hedging, but you have projects that essentially participate in many, many different ecosystems. And it's almost like the dominant strategy in order to be rewarded as much as possible. And so I think that's fine. But at the same time, we wanted to, as Alicia said, like we wanted to bring a bit more diversity into the kind of like the voting process. And so we decided to try to do this thing that is this like exotic voting method, which is a normalized impact. And the idea of normalized impact is you take the impact of the project on the OP stack. I mean, it's an estimation, of course, and then you divide it by its total impact across all ecosystems. And so a normalization comes from like linear algebra. It's the idea that if you have a list of numbers, you take every number and you divide it by the sum of all numbers. So in the case of like RetroPGF, it could be the list of numbers is the impact of a project on different ecosystem. Of course, like you have to make that number up, but you can still write it down on paper. And then you divide every number by the sum of the total impact. So if we take an example, let's say you have three ecosystem A, B, C. Let's say you have like the OP stack as ecosystem A, and then B, C is like two other ecosystem. If you write down the impact as, let's say, like 3, 6, 3, well, in isolation, the impact on the OP stack is 3, right? But if you divide it by the total impact, it becomes roughly like 0.3, right? Because you divide it by 3 plus 3 plus 6. Actually, it's more than that. It's less than that. It's like 0.25. But if you change the impact on the other ecosystem and you bring it down, as an example, closer to 0, you can still have 3 as an impact on the OP stack, but your normal, so it goes up. The idea of normalized impact is that it rewards projects that took risks by exclusively trying to like help the OP stack more than others. And we thought that maybe it would kind of like incentivize projects to, instead of trying to impact as many ecosystems as possible, which, I mean, it's great, but at the same time, like, leads to some like interesting incentive problems to incentivize projects that essentially went all in on the OP stack. Like what tools that made the OP stack much better, but did not kind of like help other ecosystem. I mean, of course, like every time you have voting methodology like that, you have to make a lot of numbers up. So the way we did it is we had a bunch of like multiplications and divisions and like relative scores. And yeah, we ended up with like some interesting results, and that's what we went for. To be fair, it's pretty clear that RetroPGF is going to be in like a really hard problem in order to define like who should get rewarded, specifically because right now, I mean, methods are quite primitive, and even in the future, we're talking about like it's kind of like democracy. You know, it's like simple in theory. I mean, it's simple to explain what democracy is, but it's a huge problem of aggregating preferences with humans. And here it's a huge problem of aggregating impact with people. So yeah, I'm just excited what kind of technology is going to be built here, because we'll need specific things. We're not going to make it with like forms and spreadsheets. It's going to be really interesting.
Oh man, I love all of that. I so strongly agree that the voting algorithms and all that and the preference aggregation is super, super exciting and like, one of the key problems here. Ludens, I just want to make sure I'm playing back what you said, right? Because I think it's really interesting. Basically, this normalized impact, what you're saying is that basically the voting algorithm that you did discounted or like it took into account impact to the optimism ecosystem relative to others. That's basically what you're saying. So if, for example, like if everyone uses Geth, then there's a smaller slice of the impact that is to optimism from Geth versus everything else.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I did not allocate much votes to Geth as an example. Whereas, and same with protocol guilds and all of those, because I mean, those get funded through many other methods. And so because it doesn't mean we should fund them more. Of course, they should be funded a lot. Like there should be a disproportionate funding going to those projects. But the idea here is that you might end up just with, like, we're going to get RetroPGF politics the more it is implemented across ecosystems. And we're going to get like RetroPGF hackers that are essentially are going to try to like do a little thing that impacts a gajillion ecosystem in order to like go around and be rewarded a tiny bit. And I just want to start experimenting with rewarding folks that like make outsized bet on a single ecosystem.
Yeah. I love the vibe there of considering optimism, because I think that this is one of the key points that I think is a little bit lost in the sauce sometimes with all the public goods funding narratives that we have. It's like, ultimately, I mean, it's what I started with, right? Like, ultimately, this is the collective solving a market failure that it suffers from. It's not some act of charity to have everyone excited. So for that reason, I strongly agree with that. And I love the idea of doing this normalized impact scoring because it addresses that and it's in that vibe and it's a cool experiment. I want to ask you a follow-up question though. How do you think this relates to means testing, right? So one of the other very active conversations between the badge holders, I mean, since the first round, I mean, if you can go back to Vitalik's first blog post, he talks a lot about what we call means testing, which is just saying how much should the scoring and the sort of the impact score of a project be changed by what the sources of funding are, right? So one of the critical things that we did in this round was every project nomination had to self-report basically and then be validated by badge holders what their sources of funding were. So that was a very deliberate attempt to make the means testing more apparent so that people can say, okay, sure, this was a public good, but it was created by a very, very well-capitalized organization that has a reason for this public good to exist and is making their own profits off of it. Okay, sorry. So all that's a long-winded way to ask you, Ludens, like, how do you think that what you just described with normalized impact compares to means testing? Because I have this intuition that, sure, if they're contributing to 100 other ecosystems, then that's like that somehow feels less impactful. But also, if 99 others aren't funding that and only Optimism is, and it seems like it gets more complicated. What do you think of that long-winded question-ish thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I'm going to not answer it by answering a different thing, but essentially the thing, okay, but I'm actually, okay, I'll take a shot at answering it. But the first thing I find fascinating is that, so here, it's very much, the idea was very much, I mean, from my reverse engineering of the people that have like set up this round, like it's like, okay, let's reward the things that have helped the stack that were not funded, right? But ultimately it seems like the logical extreme of RetroPGF is that you should have people that essentially like raise money in exchange for future RetroPGF. Like that just seems obvious to me, because there is a world where like you don't have to go through extremely convoluted ways of being rewarded by building open source software or like open source education or whatever. Like the thing that is super interesting from a market perspective in this industry is that people are inventing new convoluted ways to be rewarded for open source software and making protocols and stuff like that. And RetroPGF is essentially like a compression of all of those things together and an aggregation of like all of that into a massive political system. It's like, hey, you don't have to like do X or Y or Z or like like, I don't know. It's just, I mean, right now it's like the meta is like, you can make a token, you can try to build a revenue generating business, you can try to be acquired, or you can, or like I don't know, wildcard. The idea, I think, here is that, hey, let's push everything towards a final instantiation of the market where there are extremely complex impact aggregation systems that will reward you perfectly, or like as perfectly as possible, without you having to go through like things that actually bring you away from your mission and away from impact in order to secure like a return for you and like your investors or whoever you care about. And so I think that I hope that we're not going to normalize discounting things that have been funded. I did discount things that have been funded on top of the normalized impact, because I feel like this round was more about kind of like fixing the fuck up as opposed to setting the tone for where it's going to crystallize as a system. But it's definitely an interesting problem, because you like, I think there's nothing better in terms of signal that RetroPGF is working than a team raising venture capital from extremely kind of like as like capitalistic as possible investors that like do not give a single shit about public good, that then would build open source projects and tell their investors that they would be rewarded by RetroPGF. Like, there is no better signal of the system working than that happening. And so right now, the thing is, if we kind of like normalize discounting those projects, it gives a chilling effect over that happening. I don't know if this really answers the question, but I think we're definitely in interesting incentive design territory here, and we have to be careful about discounting things that have received external funding.
Can you say more about what you mean by chilling effect there?
Yeah, so kind of like a chilling effect is, so, I mean, I don't think there is a real definition of chilling effect, but the way I interpret it is that chilling effect is something you can do that will like kill other things being done in the future because of what you did, right? So as an example, I mean, there are a lot of chilling effects in this industry. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna take one in particular. Okay, so no example, but
no. Well, you gave. I feel like you gave an example. Like, just walk me through it. Just walk me through the story that you just gave for the chilling effect.
Exactly. So let's say right now we all get on this Twitter space and we all say, oh, like we discounted all the projects in our voting that received external funding from investors that want to maximize shareholder return, right? Why did we do that? Well, we did this in order to to reward folks that do not have other means of funding apart from grants, or maybe like some like sustainable revenue generating business in order to get them to do stuff. And then in the future, like, this might kill the future timeline where some folks go to literally, I don't know, like, I mean, venture capitalists in technology actually are pretty open to like weird ways of making money. But like, let's say like in the future, I think there would be nothing better than someone getting a bunch of capital from infrastructure developer, like literally the people that build like things like bridges and like ports and stuff like that, in order to build, I don't know, a node for the OP stack. And they tell them, hey, super conventional investor XYZ, our way of making money is we're going to give you future cut of our retroactive PGF. Like, that's literally how we're going to do it. And if this happens, this is actually one of the best signals of RetroPGF working as an incentive design mechanism. But we might be killing this future by discounting it right now, even if it doesn't matter that much. It matters more for the future product than the current one. That's what I'm saying.
Oh man, preach. Oh, that's so good. Okay, I'm scared of monopolizing conversation, but that's a great point. I think the way I would play that back, like in some of the language that we've had in the past, is I think the way that I would express that then is that the idea is that means testing may not provide a nuanced enough description of the source of the means. And there's a difference between an organization that maintains a open source library that is critical for their operation as a business and their profitability as a business, because through some form of value extraction. But even if that company has as much money as another company that has taken investment and then is trying to get retro funding, what we're saying is that even at the same amount of money, those are effectively different means, which I think is a super valid point. Oh man, I love that one. Jonas, maybe we can hear from you a little bit.
Sorry, you cut off for me for the last 5 seconds, so I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, all good. I just said basically that I think the way that I would interpret what you're, another way to say what you're saying, which is a point that I really love, is that means testing, like the means is insufficiently described by just a amount of capitalization. Like the intent of the capitalization and the source of those means are also extremely relevant and change the precedents that we're trying to set. So that's what I was saying. That is a great point. Oh man, that's exciting.
There's a lot in there. I'm super with you on the eventual market implications of this. And I think you're right. In these early stages, there's a lot of delicate sort of norm setting around how we're evaluating things to reach that impact equals profit ratio that we talk about. And so it's like, how do you define profit? Is venture funding profit that we should be discounting on? Or are we saying literally if you're getting paid for this work on an ongoing basis from some sale of goods or services or the thing that you're building, then that is helping compensate you for your impact. There's a lot in there. And some of those things are very subtle around like even the questions that we ask projects when they're getting nominated. I think in this past round, one of the application form questions was, what are your sources of funding? Which is different from how much profit did your project make this year? And so there's a lot of really subtle stuff like that that we can continue to play with over future rounds. I'm excited to see where it goes. And I think Ben was gonna do this, and I'm just gonna follow in his shoes and pass the mic over to Jonas to ask some questions of folks on this call. I think there are a couple of folks who received funding in addition to Ludens. And so, Jonas, I'm going to pass it over to you to kind of see what the experience was like as a project nominated for RetroPGF, who ultimately received some funding as voted on by the badge holders.
Yes, 100%. I think what's exciting about a day like this is we often talk about public goods and like these frameworks for thinking about it. For instance, like the scope we set up this round in the abstract. And a day like this where we put out this list of 195 projects, how many tokens they received, that makes it very real. And you can go on like the discovery page that we built and you can find out about all these projects, what they're doing, how they're benefiting the ecosystem. And a day like this is not only, I think, interesting because of the tokens itself, but also because the badge holders are kind of making a collective impact assessment. So it's not only saying you get this many tokens, but it's also kind of a statement, a testimony to the impact a project has had. Something that's not always very intuitive to end up on if you want to find out about a public goods project. And so super excited to hear a bit more about the people that we have with us representing projects that got funded. Charlie, we haven't heard from you yet. You weren't a badge holder. You're working with Agora. Agora was in the top 10, I think, of the tooling and utilities category for this round in terms of recipients. Maybe you want to tell us a bit more about what you're building. How is this benefiting the Optimism Collective, and what was your experience going into this round of RetroPGF?
Yeah, and just to kind of riff on that a little bit, it's like, agree very much that it's one thing to kind of think through the theory. I remember when I first read the post about RetroPGF, it was very exciting, but it's another kind of as a recipient to say, like, wow, like it's very encouraging as a public goods builder. And it actually changes a lot of how we're thinking internally about what does that mean for our roadmap, and it kind of changes the incentives, I think, a lot of the conversations earlier. So we got involved because we built a delegation and voting portal for token house proposals and delegates. You can find us at vote.optimism.io. It's open sourced, MIT licensed, and it's governance front end. And now we're working a little bit on improving the contract as well. And we got started with kind of like, we work with Nouns, ENS, thanks to Alicia, and a couple more to come. And for our experience is that as we're building a kind of a public good, this kind of mechanism is very exciting to us, as it's always been a goal of ours to kind of align the incentives between us, our users, and stakeholders. And truthfully, as a builder and small team, it is honestly a little bit spooky and scary at first, because you're not sure how to plan around something like this, right? Like grants are kind of meant to kick things off, but like, how do you actually sustain kind of this, like, sustain the project, like continuously improving, maintaining and everything. Like we were initially funded by Nouns, but alternative options like this is quite eye-opening. So I guess from my perspective and kind of our perspective, I've spent the last kind of decade building and scaling Web2 startups. And, typically for, I guess, the more traditional businesses or what you will, organizations, as time goes on, it's almost a necessity that more and more resources of the business get spent onto sales, marketing, kind of go-to-market function. And right, like it kind of takes it contrasts to actually building for the customer. And you can kind of see this pretty clearly by just like most companies' headcount over time shifts into go-to-market, and it becomes like 50%, 70% over time, and kind of away from customer and engineering. And this is quite interesting because for us, and especially if you're building kind of like public goods and a kind of a non-obvious or non-proven business model, this is quite interesting because it actually changes the incentives. It allows us to really just build a really good product and kind of trust that we could be rewarded for it afterwards.
That's a really interesting point that I actually didn't consider previously, how it shifts the incentives internally for an organization. I think it's like an interesting point to nudge on like the usual incentive is to maximize like value capture with every dollar spent. So you're starting to spend a lot on like sales, conversion, marketing, right? Versus if you're building a public good and only out for like the maximum impact, that's not essentially like the same incentive scheme and how you would spend your resources internally. I think overall the point is really interesting of how do you deal with something like this now, and how do you plan with retroactive public goods funding in mind, and how could we make this something that projects are more comfortable with planning or more comfortable with thinking about it as a possible income stream. Chris, maybe you want to talk a bit about L2Beat. I think you were also one of the top projects in this round.
Yeah, sure. So actually, there were two projects of mine that were nominated. I can talk about both of them, but obviously I haven't voted on any of them, just to clarify. Like, this would be like an obvious conflict of interest. But as for L2Beat is mostly a website which gathers all the different research and statistics about different layer 2s scaling solutions for Ethereum. So, for example, if you go to l2bit.com right now, you're gonna see some missing bits of decentralization in Optimism, right? But that goes as well for any other project right now. But what we try to do is we try to, educate users and push projects into, full decentralization in the future. Like, obviously, it's not that simple that we can make non-upgradable perfect rollups from day one, but this is the direction that we want to go. And, L2Beat is trying to educating the whole community about the risks associated with using the current state of the rollups. But obviously we're bullish on the long term of the development of the technology and so on. And, I need to say that we are amazed by the support that we received in this round. And I'm really excited about, the work that we're going to deliver in upcoming months, thanks to this additional funding. I'm sure that we're going to play with OP stack and, come up with some interesting, research materials on it. And it's going to be amazing. One maybe interesting thing about the other project that I was also involved with that received some support, it's called TypeChain, and it was really popular. It's still a really popular dev tool. It has 200,000 monthly downloads. But what's interesting is that actually these days there are slowly better tools out there, with totally different approach. And, on one hand, it's amazing to be rewarded for the hard work that we did across years, because it took I think 5 years to develop TypeChain to this point. But I can see how this money is not going to be spent on TypeChain, but rather on some next projects and, the projects that are going to be more relevant in this current ecosystem. And I think it's also great that, we received some funding retroactively, but it doesn't, it's not like we need to spend it on this exact thing. we can just, spend it on new exciting projects that will, push the needle again, as TypeChain did 5 years ago.
That's really great to hear that the retroactive part is actually working out, and also that you don't feel any pressure now to further invest or maintain this project just because of receiving this funding. I'm curious on L2Beat, a question that you might get, right, as you're acting as this public interface which shows to users the risks of different layer twos. On there, you obviously also have Optimism mainnet. Now you received a chunk of RetroPGF, chunk of Optimism tokens. Do you think this will influence how Optimism is evaluated in L2Beat in any way? And if not, why?
Yes, I'm just creating PR that will say that Optimism is fully decentralized. No, but for real, it's an excellent question, right? Because these sorts of conflicts can arise, but I think we are well aware of this as a team, and basically that's why also you won't ever find any advertisements on l2bit.com, because we know that the neutrality is our killer feature. If we're not neutral, if we can be bribed in any way, this means the end of the project, right? So this is the hill that I'm gonna die on, obviously, and the whole team with me. Receiving the support from Optimism in practice, it means that we're gonna have even more funding to conduct a broad research on different layer twos. But probably we will also, knowing that Optimism supports us, we're gonna do some research more focused on OP technology as well. But that doesn't mean obviously any changes to the risk assessment. It means rather that we'll have resources to dive into things that we wouldn't have resources to dive into otherwise. I don't know, OP stack, I already mentioned it. I can't wait to play more with the technology behind OP stack.
Cool. I think that's great. That's great to hear that this retroactive funding isn't an influence there, and I think it's a spicy topic to think about. I think we're a bit late on time, but super curious to hear from Ludens on OP Craft and Mud. I have a short fun anecdote. I went to the OP Cafe in Bogota at DEF CON, and I walked in and some guy was playing Minecraft or some clone of it on his laptop, and I was a bit confused and asking this person why they're playing Minecraft, and then they told me the whole story about Mud and OP Craft and how it works, and I was blown away. So Ludens, maybe you want to tell us a bit more about what you created there and how it fits into the Optimism ecosystem.
Mr. Mac, I think you might have to smash a button to let Ludens chat.
Yeah, I think we might have lost Ludens. He's been having some internet issues, and I do not see a request to speak from him. But in the interim, we'll try and get him back up. But yeah, I can vouch for that. Thank you, Ludens, for the 2 weeks of my life that were lost to playing this on-chain voxel game. It was incredibly fun, and I can't wait to see what the folks at Lattice do next. Since we don't have Ludens, I actually want to pose a question. We are close to time, and I don't want to start to wrap it up, but I actually want to pose this question to Ben, Jonas, and Bobby of, were there any recipients of this round of RetroPGF2 that were a surprise for you all?
I think overall, I was surprised that out of the 195 projects, everybody got some amount of OP tokens. So to recap a bit on the rules there, we were very much hands-off in terms of the curation and filtering of applications and nominees. So I think what we said there is, as long as you're not impersonating another project, or as long as you're not completely not relating to the scope of this round. So for instance, if you have really nothing to do with the OP stack, then we wouldn't let you participate. I think in the end, we didn't rule out anybody on these kind of qualitative rules. But the only reason people, I think like a handful of projects didn't get to participate is because they weren't nominated in time. And so I think overall was super surprised that really the spread of funds was so broad across all these projects, and that you really saw this long tail of like 50, 60 projects that got, I think, below 1% or 0.5% of the vote each. But because of the high amount of OP tokens, it was still kind of impactful to them.
Very interesting. Any insights from Ben? Sounds like you might have something to add.
Yeah, I'll just say another thing that really surprised me about the results was how darn close to 1/3 the distribution was across each of the categories. To be very clear, those were just buckets that we put projects in so that you could sort them and look at them, more easily and according to your expertise. What ended up happening is that the distribution of votes landed very close to evenly across those categories, despite there being, 200 projects split between them. So I thought that was really interesting. I think that it's a fascinating question. For example, if we were to break out the tooling, category that was like tooling, dependencies or something, if we were to have broken those into more categories, how would that have changed the distribution? I think it's a really fascinating question that we need to toy around with in future rounds.
Do you think you might split like badge holders, like A/B test RetroPGF, with things like labeling or?
Interesting. That's a really interesting idea. Like 2 rounds, 2 different sets of badge holders, some variable changes, see how the funding varies.
So same projects and just like a different environment.
That is a very cool idea. I love that too, because you can do it with the same. It lets you test like an independent variable at that front end, right? Because you can still give everyone the same fundamental voting rights and voting permissions, but then just like have them go through a different flow. That's pretty crazy. I'm very interested in that.
So that's a very nice transition into my next question, which is, we know what comes after 2, it's 3. And so Bobby, Ben, and Jonas, do you want to share any alpha on OP Radio today about maybe how RetroPGF 3 will be different, how you're thinking about improving it? Is there anything you'd like to say there?
There's a ton that we can think about iterating on. Like, I think some of the stuff that was touched on even in this discussion, like how badge holders are evaluating projects past funding, how we're surfacing information about projects to people, how we help badge holders lean into their expertise and versus like requiring them to do a bunch of research on other projects. Things like delegation and voting specificity and voting by category rather than voting by project. Even everything like down to the voting algorithm that we use to actually tally up folks' votes. There's a ton that we can experiment with. I'll say 2 things. One is we just announced the results today, and in the next 2 weeks or so, we will also publish a more detailed reflection on how this round went. That includes a lot of the feedback from folks who participated, either as badge holders or as projects. So we can do this kind of collective sense making and iteration together in full light of day. And then we will be announcing RetroPGF round 3 in the next month or so. And what that announcement includes is the total OP amount that RetroPGF 3 will allocate, as well as a reiteration of the scope of RetroPGF 3. And hopefully this time, a couple more easy ways to identify a piece of work that you could do as a community member, as a builder, as a contributor, to contribute to something that will ideally be up for retro funding. So we're trying to overall just make this process more accessible to folks and bring more people into the collective and get this retro machine humming.
Awesome. Ben, anything you'd like to add before we close this out?
No, I think we hit a lot of it. I think the most important thing to say is that regardless of the details being announced in a month, RetroPGF 3 is coming. That is critical. What we are doing here does not make sense unless we are setting precedents in the process. So it is very, very, very important that we continue to do it, and we will do so, and keep talking about the precedents that we are setting. Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Well, with that, I'd like to sincerely thank all the speakers who have joined us on OP Radio today. Thanks to all the listeners as well. Huge shout out to all the people and projects involved in this round of RetroPGF 2. We literally could not have done it without you, especially the badge holders. You know who you are. You guys are amazing. just a quick call to action. If you haven't already read the mirror that Alicia mentioned, you can find that at optimism.mirror.xyz. We've put out a lot of great material on this round of RetroPGF2, and that mirror post is going to be your easiest entryway into all these different assets. And lastly, this episode will be edited and uploaded for you to listen to later on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and Google. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Stay optimistic, and we'll see you on the internet, y'all.